Okay, this is a video for anyone who's employing staff and charging them out to a job or to a client, and you're not sure how much profit you're making or if you're making a profit on that employee. So you might be asking yourself questions like, is my charge out rate high enough? Is my employee recovering enough to turn a profit? And so this is highly relevant to trades, anyone in the trades game, plumbers, electricians, chippies, and it applies to a whole host of employers, and really anyone where you've got an employee doing work and you're charging them out at an hourly rate to your client or to your job. And I think a lot of people, unfortunately, probably fly pretty blind in this space. They will hear that the electrician down the road is charging out their employee at $100 an hour, and so they'll copy that. Their old boss might have charged them out at $100 an hour, and they've now gone out on their own, and so they're just that's what they know and that's what they're used to, so that's what they keep. You can sort of sit there guessing all day whether it's right or wrong, but the easiest way is to do a little exercise, fill out this little model, and that way we can know for sure where we're currently at and what steps we could take to improve if we need to improve. Or you might do this and you say, hey, we're actually making pretty good profit. We don't need to change any of these things. Let's look at something else in the business that might be a problem. And so let's just step through this one step at a time, and hopefully at the end you'll have a good idea of how this works and how you can use it in your business to gain a bit of clarity over those key questions. This is something as well you could do annually, or you could do maybe quarterly, but even just doing it once per year, this is a half an hour exercise. You could seriously improve the condition of your business. And so let's go through it. So first number we need here is the total overheads of our business. And so this is not labor costs, this is not direct materials costs, but this is everything else. Okay, so if you look at your profit and loss statement, it'll be all those overhead costs in the middle. So you're going to have advertising costs, bank fees, accounting fees, motor vehicle costs, rent costs if you're renting a shed or a workshop, storage costs, travel costs when you're away on jobs, and the whole host of things, phone, internet, all of that. And so here we've just estimated this $135,000. So we're just dealing with a nice small business here. And that's the first figure that goes in here. Now, before I continue on, I should probably mention this here. This is called a labor rate calculator, and it's really just focusing on the labor costs and the charge out of that labor. We're not talking about materials here. So, you're going to have material costs on jobs that you're going to mark up and bill on. That profit or that calculation is sort of done separately. Here we're purely focusing on our employees and how much they're bringing in. So just remember that as we go through this process here. But next up, we're just filling in this top section here, and then the rest of this is all formulas. So it does all the work. So all we need to do is get our employees. So in this example, we've got 3 employees, James, Lee, and Charles, and then we're just going to fill out this info here for them. Going through this, we're saying there's 52 weeks in the year. So they're getting paid for the 52 weeks, but they're not going to be working or charging out for every week, and we'll explain that. So they're working 5 days of the week. They're working 8 hours a day. This here is a key figure. This is our estimated non-billable or non-chargeable hours per day. So here I've got 0.75 of an hour, so that equates to 45 minutes. And we're saying that's an estimate of the time where they're not charging out to the client. They're in the workshop, they're tidying up the workshop, they're picking up supplies, they're doing, they're doing a dump run, they're doing training, they're doing something where we're not charging them out. And that might be low for some businesses or high for other businesses, depending on how tight the ship you're running. But that is a key lever that we can pull to affect our profit. So if we said, our employees are sitting around half the day and they're not charging out to jobs, and maybe that's because it's a quiet day or a quiet week, if we could fill those gaps and get this number as low as we possibly can, it's going to greatly help our profit. Next up is our charge out rate. So what we're actually charging our employees out at to the customer. And so here we've got, $80 an hour. And again, that would be a net of GST figure there. And next is our rate of pay. So, our base wage, James is on $32 an hour. Superannuation, 12%. Payroll tax, got it in at 0. This is a small business. They would be below the payroll tax threshold. If you were a bigger business, you would have to think about payroll tax as well. And then workers' compensation, typically this will be a rate. Here I've got 4.5%, and that's your workers' comp. Different states will have their different plans, but on average, that's probably a reasonable rate for someone in the trades game. And so that's just factored onto their wage, and that's you're paying your insurance premiums every year. Other costs, I've just left this, other labor costs, I've just left this blank, but that might be something like an allowance, like a tool allowance, or maybe a bonus, something like that. And then here we're thinking about days where we're not actually working. So we've got 12 public holidays, which you're paying your staff for, but they're not working. 4 weeks of holidays, if they're going to take all 4 weeks, there we are. And then 2 weeks of sick leave. Again, hopefully you guys, they don't need all 2 weeks, but here we're factoring them in. Okay, and that's basically all you've got to do in terms of putting in info, and then the spreadsheet does the rest. So let's look at some figures. And this one here, first one here is potential billable hours for the year. And that's basically just a sum of 50, or a multiplication of our 52 weeks, our 5 days a week, and our 8 hours a day. That's saying that's the total potential hours we could charge, but we don't charge them all because we've got to take out all these other hours. And so this is this number here. We're taking out 500 hours for that part of the day where they're at work, but they're not actually billing their time out because it's non-chargeable time. And we're also factoring in our public holidays, our paid annual leave, and our sick days. And so that leaves us with about 1,580 hours that that employee is charging. They're on the job, on the tools, they're charging to the job, or they're charging out at their charge out rate. That might be a little bit high for some or a little bit low for others. Again, that's what all these inputs will tell us. But that's probably not far off for a lot of people. And then here we're just doing a few sums on our labor costs. So our base salary for James here, 66,000, plus his superannuation, plus the amount of workers' comp that we're paying for James, gets us up to our total labor burden of 77,000. So while James's salary, his base salary is 66 grand, in total there's 77 grand worth of costs just to keep him on. And all these other calculations, they really run off of that billable hours figure. So that's why it's so important, is we're saying, all right, we're paying him for 2,000 hours, but James is only billing out to the client for 1,500 hours, and that's the number we have to run all of our calculations on. And that's the number we have to work out if we're making a profit based on that amount of hours. And so what we're saying here is that $77,000 cost for James split over his 1,500 hours means that it's $49 an hour just to keep him employed while he's charging out. And most people, that will make sense. They look at the 80, they say, oh, well, we're charging him out at $80 an hour. He's costing us $50 an hour, so we're making a profit of $30 an hour. Great. But this is where a lot of people go wrong. They forget to factor in their overhead costs. So they think they've got an awesome profit, $30 an hour, but after they factor in their overhead costs, the picture sort of worsens. So what we're saying here is we've got 135 grand worth of, the vehicles, the insurances, all those other costs, and we're going to recover those over the course of these billable hours throughout the year. That means there's an extra $28 worth of cost per hour that we have to make back in order to just break even and just cover these costs, the overheads. And so here you get to a point where you say, all right, if we add these two numbers together, James is really sort of costing $77.50. Well, he's got to make more than 77.5 to turn a profit on his share of the hours. And when we compare that to his charge out rate's $80 an hour. The cost is 77.5. The profit margin per hour is pretty slim there at $2.50. It might be a lot slimmer than you think. And for Charles, for example, he's more of a senior bloke. We're paying him more, but he's also charging out more, and his profit per hour is $10.70. So that might surprise some people. And again, if you were, a lot of people will fail to sort of factor in those overhead costs here. If we look at this in chart form, which is often a bit easier to digest, we're saying our total revenue from our charge out is 482,000, and that is simply the charge out hours multiplied by our charge out rates. So that should be pretty straightforward. Minus all of our employment costs, so all the wages, super, workers' comp, etc. Again, we're paying for holidays and all that. Minus our overhead costs gets us down to our pretty slim yearly profit there of $27,000 for the business. Now, again, as I mentioned at the start, a big component of a lot of jobs is probably going to be a material component. So if you're marking up your materials and charging those onto your jobs, that profit is going to come in here as extra profit. And so for your overall business, your profit's going to be higher than 27,000. But purely looking at the labor component, and also if you were running a business that you did a lot of smaller sort of maintenance jobs, and there was a much bigger labor component and a smaller material component, as opposed to jobs that have a huge material component, this is going to be even more relevant for you. And so you can see that that's a fairly slim profit margin there. So let's just have a play with this to see, all right, what things could we be thinking about to boost our profit? The most obvious one is always the charge out rate. If you increase your charge out rate, your profit's just going to go straight up, because it goes straight to the bottom line. These are obviously, it's sensitive to your market. You might feel like you can't lift them. You might be run off your feet and you go, all right, let's lift our charge out rates, because even if we lose a few jobs, we're still busy enough, and the extra profit is going to be more than the jobs that we lost. So let's just say, all right, what happens if let's just increase everyone by $5 an hour, and we can see our profit there is just doubled. So just $5 an hour increase in charge out rate has doubled our profit almost doubled from 27 up to 50,000. Okay. Now again, may or may not be possible, depending on where you're at and how busy you are and what your competitors are doing and where you're located and all those things. But that is the big one that moves the needle really quick. And I would challenge you to think about that. The other one that could move the needle is minimizing our non-billable hours. And this is, accountants love this. If you ever go into an accounting firm, they're always talking about their productivity of all their staff, and they want to be charging out as high as possible, and they want to have their non-billable hours as low as possible. And so that's a mindset that, well, I wouldn't recommend you take it to that extent of lawyers and accountants, but it should certainly be something you think about. So you might be able to schedule your jobs. If you're doing lots of small maintenance jobs, you might be able to schedule them in a way that the travel time is reduced and you're able to gain some efficiency there. You might be meeting at the job site instead of at the workshop, etc., etc. Planning the day and the week better so that we can minimize our non-chargeable time. And here I've just knocked 15 minutes off a day. So now we're only non-chargeable for 30 minutes a day instead of 45. And you can see again, that's just added an extra $18,000 in profit right there. Maybe your guys aren't taking 2 full weeks of sick leave. Maybe they're only taking 1 week of sick leave. So, that's culture, that's employees, that's picking the right guys and keeping them happy. And, it's that culture word, I guess. And if that comes up, again, you've just boosted your profits a little bit as well. The boys like coming to work and working hard, and they're not chucking sickies. So there's just a few basic things that you could think about in order to boost that figure. I mean, if we trimmed some overheads out, so we're going to, instead of 135, we're going to find $5,000 worth of costs, and there might be some subscriptions or some expensive phone bills and all that sort of stuff. And again, we've just recovered an extra $5,000. So we've just gone from 27 grand up to 85 grand worth of profit. And that's in a very small business with 3 guys here. And again, we've made some assumptions, but you can see how these levers can move the needle. And, that's not even talking about, all right, materials, markups on materials, like job types, what type of jobs we're doing. Your profit margin on certain jobs is going to be way higher or lower than others. And so you might do this as part of your analysis, and you might also look at your job mix and say, all right, we keep losing money on these little maintenance jobs. They're keeping us busy. We're running around town doing them, but our profit per hour on those jobs is bugger all. Let's stop doing those and focus on these other jobs. And so there's all sorts of things you can do, but this is a super helpful tool that I'd recommend you use. Get in touch. I'll give you a copy. I'll help you fill it out. And we can, hopefully use it to try to improve our profitability. So thank you guys for watching. Hope you found this useful, and I'll talk to you soon. Thanks.